Hey man, y'all know who this is, man. Shout out to Crossover Nation, you heard? Yes, sir.
Yo, what's up? My name is Swish, and today I'm going to be debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. People who say that today's NBA is more advanced than yesterday's NBA. Alright, so we're going to go over a few topics. One of them being super teams of today versus teams of yesterday. Be sure to watch this video all the way through. Check the facts. Do fact checks. Let me know down below in the comments whether I'm right or wrong. I don't know. But I did a bunch of research because this is a major topic that's been going on. A lot of guys saying that today's NBA is much more advanced than yesterday's NBA. And I just wanted to check out some numbers to see why and how people have come to this conclusion. Here we go. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Crossover Nation. I'm Swishy. Holla. NBA myth number 1. Today's super teams are better than yesterday's NBA teams. Super teams are becoming more popular. It's not like back in the day when every team had like one or two superstars with a bunch of role players. But not just regular role players. Guys like Dennis Rodman, Ben Wallace, who were known to grab rebounds and play in tenacious defense. Shooters like John Paxson, Steve Kerr, whose jobs were to only do just that. These type of players had a different type of impact. Many people believe that LeBron James started the super team hoopla. However, in my opinion, that was started back in the mid-2000s when Paul Pierce joined up with Boston Celtics along with Kevin Garnett and Rajon Rondo and Ray Allen. Although pretty much these guys were old and not anymore in their primes. They did make a run at the Eastern Conference Finals in 2008 and in 2009, but came up short both seasons. It is very true that if a team adds 3 of the league's premier players to a single team, that it would most likely have a major impact on that team. Chances of reaching the final spike. And as we know it, it does take a bit of time before players become acquainted with each other, as in the case with the Big Three in 2010 when King James decided to take his talents to South Beach. That team fell short also in Game 6 of the NBA Finals to the Dallas Mavericks that season. The acquisition of super teams, no matter when it started, made it easier for teams to surround superstars with much needed talent, a la the recent acquisition of James Harden to the Brooklyn Nets, joining Kevin Durant and Kyrie Irving. However, with the exception of the 2016 Golden State Warriors, who went 73-9, no other team has been able to achieve what the Chicago Bulls achieved in 1995-96 season, when they won a then record 72 regular season games out of 82 and are widely regarded as one of the greatest teams in NBA history. That team received international recognition in 1990 when the all-star shooting guard Michael Jordan led the team to 6 league championships. The only 2 franchises that have won more championships than the Bulls are the Boston Celtics and the Los Angeles Lakers, who have 17 championships each, although the Golden State Warriors tie the Bulls with 6 championships. We must note that out of 51 titles between all 4 programs, only 9 of which happened during the 2000s. The Boston Celtics and the Lakers dominated throughout the 70s and 80s, while the Bulls dominated in the 90s. At the same time, these were not considered super teams. Only 3 franchises, the Boston Celtics, the Chicago Bulls, and the Lakers, have ever pulled off a three-peat over the last 7+ decades. A team in today's NBA might be super, but none have been able to accomplish the feats of their forefathers in yesterday's NBA. So, how super are these teams? So when it comes to super teams, I'll let you be the judge. And I know what you're thinking. Yo, Swish, how can you believe that teams back in the day are better than teams now just because Jordan dominated the 90s and the Celtics and blah, blah, blah? I know what you think. But before you jot down that comment, let me bring you on to NBA myth number 2, which is players in today's NBA are bigger and stronger than players of yesterday's NBA. Mystery myth number 2. Here we go. Well, let me start this off by saying no, that is false. Stronger? Well, stronger is a different story. I mean, nowadays there's modern training techniques which allows players to have longer and healthier careers, and it boosts in salaries, which requires players to be in top shape. That helps. While in the 90s, the players were still drinking beers at halftime during the games. In 1991, the average height was 79.23 inches as compared to today in 2021, in which teams' average heights are 6'6", rather 78.89 9 inches, which in fact is the lowest over the past 40 years. The last decade was the first in the history of the league when NBA players got shorter than a decade before. Well, in fact, NBA point guards now are 6'3", which happens to be the tallest ever for point guards in the NBA. The season which presented the tallest players was around 2000 and 2001, in which the average height was 79.93 inches, which is slightly under 6'7". These numbers do adjust each year, with the lowest average height coming in 2010 at 77.84 inches, which is about 6'5". This can also be compared to weight, as in 1991, the average weight of a player was around 212 pounds. Today, the average weight of an NBA player is 216 pounds, which is a difference of only 4 pounds. So you be the judge, and you tell me if you think today's players are bigger and stronger. I mean, 4 pounds does not sound that much of a difference to me, so when the argument comes up that players are bigger and stronger, I don't see what they're talking about. While it is understandable that NBA players, especially big men, had to become agile and lighter in order to adapt to the perimeter game. This is why centers and power forwards have been shooting better over the last 15 years. Well, the good thing is only 38% of NBA players today are overweight. Are players today bigger and stronger? Probably not, but they are most likely more in shape. Alright, now I know what you're thinking. Bigger and stronger still doesn't mean anything, right? What about shooting? I mean, everybody can shoot now. Centers, point guards, power forwards. Debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. Myth number 3. Players shoot better in today's NBA than yesterday's NBA. If it is true that today's game is soft and that the no-touch rule makes it easier to get to the basket, then that should mean that it's easier to get to the basket and get more points. But in the recent years, there's been an overall increase of players trying to show how good they can shoot, especially from long range, instead of focusing on higher percentage shots. But when it comes to actual shooting percentages, are players of today's games shooting better than players of yesterday? From the beginning of the 1994-95 season through the end of the 1996-97 season, the three-point line went from 23 feet 9 inches, 22 feet at the corners, to a uniform 22 feet around the basket. That change was made as a result of below average scoring games in the season leading up to the rule change, not because players couldn't shoot. However, since the 1997 season, we have seen a fluctuated yet slight decline in shooting percentages. This decline can be attributed to players shooting more three-point baskets, which, of course, isn't a bad thing. And I'll tell you why a bit later in the video. If we look at the past 3 decades, we see a decrease from 47% to 46% field goal percentages overall. In 1990, it was slightly higher with 47.6% compared to 46% in the year 2020. Okay, now so what about three-point percentages? Also, in 1990, the entire league was shooting 33.1% overall compared to year 2020 at 35.8% from long range. Of course, we gotta shout out guys like Steph Curry, Kevin Durant, James Harden, and even LeBron James for that. Alright, so in 1979, when the three-point line was introduced into the NBA, it took teams a while to get used to the idea of shooting from distance, as the goal at the time was to shoot higher percentage shots. For example, layups, dunks, and short jumpers. In fact, during the early days, the NBA was dominated by big men. But since the introduction of the three-point line and more superior shooting, it is now quite the opposite. Now guards are dominating the game and not big men. You know that, when you're not tall enough to play basketball, that stuff. So why the change? The answer is simple math. Obviously, people have known forever that 3 is more than 2. But until advanced analytics became popular in the front office across the league, we didn't know how much more efficient it would be to shoot this many three-pointers, especially during the early days. Coming off the 2018 and 2019 season, there was an average of 32 three-pointers every game. That is an increase of 12 three-point attempts per game over a 6-year span. More threes equals more points on the board. Therefore, we see players shooting threes at any time during the game and at any time during the shot clock, resulting in more points on the board. Indeed, it's more points, but more points for the individual player, but not necessarily for the team. In fact, we see a huge increase in total three-point shooting percentages in the last 3 decades, from 34.4% in the 90s to a whopping 42.9% today. James Harden took 13.2 3-pointers per game, which is the same amount as the total team average in the 1988-89 season. And just to talk about free throws have increased over the years. In the beginning, around 65%, and since then have risen to a solid 77.3%. In 1990, the average was 76.4%. In year 2020, also 76.4%, and currently the league sits at 77.3% overall free throw percentages, which is about almost a percent higher. So, you be the judge. Well, we can obviously see that three-point shooting is better now. People are even taking much more three-point baskets in a game, which results in a higher three-point shooting percentage overall. The more shots you shoot from three-point range, the better percentage you have at the end. Debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. If players can shoot better, we see that field goals stayed about the same, three-pointers are better, free throws are about the same. You be the judge. Alright, here we go. I am still debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. And why people think today's NBA is so advanced, I would never know. But we can try to have a look as to why people do believe that today's NBA is much more advanced than yesterday's NBA. Let's keep it going. The next myth: teams are scoring more points today, putting more points on the board than yesterday's NBA. Alright, let's get right into it. In the late 1990s and into the early 2000s, offensive basketball in the NBA was nearly at its worst ever. Every season starting from 1997 and 1998 up until 2003-2004 is one of the 15 worst seasons in offensive ratings since the stats have been kept. However, when we compare today to yesterday, in 1990, the total point average per game was 108.2 points in a game, which was about the highest for the entire 90s. Today, the average is a whopping 110.1 points, which is only a 2-point difference, which is also the highest of all time. The lowest being about 97 points per game, which took place in the 1970s. The only era worse than that came in the mid-70s, where it was just simply bad basketball. The 1960s were the highest scoring days in NBA history. What we do know is, in 1961 and 62, Wilt Chamberlain averaged 50.4 points per game on a team that scored 118.8 points per game, which had a field goal percentage of 42%, which is still 10% less than what it is today. Although there has been some advancements to technical aspects of the game as far as percentages and numbers go in terms of how many points per game, those days were the highest. Now I know you're like, Swishy, what does all this mean? One would think that more points are on the board, but actually with blowouts, scheduling, and players getting rested compared to now, in which the average is 110 points per game, we see that there's no big difference on how many points that are put on the board. Therefore, debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday NBA, if teams are scoring more points overall, I mean, okay, it's true, but the difference of 2 points is not really much to call it advanced. This fact is true, but you be the judge. Who's more trash? Debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. Number 5. Teams now get less turnovers as the teams before. Okay, if you are still with me, I want to congratulate you. First of all, you are becoming a basketball genius, or a basketball god, however you want to put it. And if you're still here and you have not yet subscribed, I want you to do that now. Go down and hit the buttons and all that good stuff, while I sit here and debunk myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA. When it comes to the idea of teams being more fundamentally sound today versus yesterday, the only thing I can come up with is, how about turnovers? Which has absolutely nothing to do with actually being fundamental at all. Unless we're talking about making basic passes or dribbling or easy stuff that can result in a turnover. Other factors are important, such as possession of play, how the shot clock switched from 24 to 30 seconds and then back again. But it kind of sort of works out like this. Well, today's area is more read and react. Teams are looking to take quicker shots, making faster sets, and outscoring their opponents. While the teams of yesterday's NBA was quite the difference. They look to run the shot clock down, pound the ball inside, everybody run around, motion offense, picket fence, blah, blah, blah. So with this in mind, we have to focus on, instead of turnovers, rather turnover percentage. Turnover percentage is defined by Basketball Reference as an estimate of turnovers per 100 plays. Yeah, you should check out the formula. Alright, the 1990s were some of the lowest scoring, highest turnover years in the last half century. Over time, those turnovers figures are changing. The NBA rate of possessions ending in turnovers has decreased by 1% each decade. That's a sign things are getting better. Back in the 80s, when three-point baskets were rare, most teams practiced on getting to the basket. More than 16% of possessions ended in a turnover. Back then, the average amount of turnovers per game was 20. This season, teams are averaging about 14.1 turnovers per game. When you first look, it looks like a big decrease. Just 6 turnovers? But there are levels to this. Average effective field goal percentage, 52%, is the highest ever this season, as well as the league's pace of play. According to Basketball Reference, the number of possessions per 48 minutes reached triple digits for the first time in 30 years. So, a season when the NBA teams are playing faster and more efficiently and having more possessions are also the teams which are turning the ball over less than them. So looking at just turnovers or turnovers per game is just fine, but there are some limitations. Obviously, the players on the court are most likely to get the most turnovers, as with the player who handles the ball the most. So turnover percentage helps us control this idea somewhat by accounting for activity. In this case, field goal attempts and free throw attempts in relation to turnovers. So when we break down the percentages, the styles back in the 60s, 90s, and currently today, we can see that the style in the 60s resulted in more turnovers per game with less plays. The styles of the 90s were just more turnovers per game with more plays than the 60s, compared to the styles now, which are less turnovers per game with more plays. Sounds complicated enough? Yeah. This is why turnover percentage is very important in constructing the idea how teams play and which teams are more fundamentally sound. So we know that teams today average 3 times more turnovers per 100 plays as teams of yesterday's NBA, but at least not the worst of all times. We can conclude that this myth is false based on the turnover percentage calculation. Still better than the 90s, but not the best of all time. So the question still remains, how advanced are teams today compared to yesterday's NBA? Alright, here we go. Debunking myths about today's NBA versus yesterday's NBA, and this is one of the most wildest ones I've heard, that players in today's NBA are much more athletic than players of yesterday's NBA. I mean, how wild is this? There have always been athletic players, but this one for me is very easy. Now, it's not easy to determine which era had the most athletic players or who's just the most athletic overall, but we can see players who had the highest verticals throughout the history of basketball. And we do know that the average vertical leap for basketball players today currently is 28 inches. The highest ratings overall come from Michael Jordan, 48 inches, as well as a player by the name of Darrell Griffith, who played with the Utah Jazz in the early 80s and 90s. So without ever really being able to determine who are the most athletic players, I mean, with the exception of Zion Williamson, the biggest freak we've ever seen, I mean, it's pretty hard to say. I mean, we got Sean Kemp, guys like Vince Carter, and then you go all the way down the line up to Zach LaVine. Back in the day, Dr. J, Michael Jordan taking off from the free throw line. So which era is more athletic, today or yesterday? Earlier we said that players today, especially big guys, have to become lighter and more agile in order to adapt to the game, more in shape. Therefore, we can assume that since they are more in shape, that comes with a bit of athletic ability. So is today's game more stronger and more athletic? Probably not. But provided the fact that players are more in shape more now than ever, by this fact we can assume that players are probably more athletic as well. So therefore this myth is most likely true. But then again, you be the judge. Alright, so there you have it. I attempted to debunk common myths about the NBA, whether today's game is more advanced than yesterday's NBA. You can go down the list: super teams, bigger and stronger, shoot better, score better, turnover percentage, more athletic, so on and so forth. If you agree or don't agree, feel free to hit me up in the comments below. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel, Crossover Nation. I am Swish. I don't miss.
Hey man, y'all know who this is, man. Shout out to Crossover Nation, you heard? Yeah, sir.